If Eve Calder opened that door, she could lose her life. If she didn't, her husband's last remaining piece of land could fall into the hands of the man who killed him. The wind on Cold Mesa stopped blowing at the very moment the sun disappeared behind the red cliffs. Not a single bird, not a single horse. Only thin snow slid across the low stone cabin roof, silently, like ashes covering an old grave. Eve stood by the water barrel behind the house, Ben Calder's rifle within reach. For the past 2 years, she had learned to live without anyone. She chopped wood herself, mended her own roof, locked her own door before darkness crept down the ravine. But that afternoon, something had been moved from its place. A small stone with a red leather cord tied to it lay tilted on the snow. Ben had told her never to touch it. No explanation, no further words. Just that some things on this land didn't belong to the living to be bought and sold. Eve bent down but didn't pick it up. She looked at the deep hoof prints beside her. Military hoof prints. Then another footprint, softer, lighter, dragged, bloody. A loud bang came from the front door. Once, then again. Eve stepped into the cabin, loading her rifle. This house was all Ben had left. If anyone came to take it, they would have to step over her gun first. She opened the door slightly. An Apache man slumped on the stone threshold, his shoulder drenched in blood, his hand still clutching a piece of oilcloth. His eyes were open, dark, and frighteningly alert. Eve pointed the gun at his chest. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't plead for help. He only breathed hoarsely through his cracked, blood-stained lips. "Don't let Crowe get this way." Eve was speechless. That name hadn't been spoken in her house since the day Ben died. Then the Apache man looked straight at her and continued, "Your husband didn't die because of Apache." Eve Calder didn't lower her gun. The door remained open, the cold wind blowing through her skirt, carrying the smell of fresh blood and wet snow. The Apache lay half on the porch, half on the stone threshold, as if Cold Mesa himself hadn't decided whether to let him in or not. "Say it again," Eve said hoarsely. "What did you just say about my husband?" The man tried to lift his head. Blood seeped through the leather jacket at his shoulder, dripping onto the stone floor in slow, heavy drops. In his clenched hand was a piece of oilcloth stained with red mud and gunpowder. He looked at Ben's rifle, then at Eve. "Ben Calder saw what he didn't see," he said. "Guns in flour barrels, military insignia scraped from the barrels. Crowe sold them to bandits and let the Apache take the blame." Eve wanted to slam the door shut, to let the snow do the rest. A wounded Apache in her house would make her a traitor in the eyes of all the landowners around Cold Mesa. But Crowe's name had just fallen to the floor like an unexploded bullet. Outside, the wind turned, lashing against the cliffs. In the distance, a horse neighed, and then fell silent. Eve gritted her teeth, pulling back her gun half an inch. "If you're lying, I won't need Crowe to kill you." The man almost smiled, but pain cut across his face. "My name is Kase, and if you want to keep this cabin, you'll have to pull me in before the bloodstains freeze." Eve paused for another moment. Then she set the rifle down near the door, grabbed his shirt collar, and pulled. Kase was heavier than she expected. Blood left a dark trail on the stone floor, running straight into the house Ben had built with his own hands. When the door closed, Eve saw a fresh hoofprint on the snow outside the porch. Not Casey's, not hers. Someone has followed him all the way here. Eve bolted the door with an oak stick, then stood still and listened. Outside, the wind swept across the stone porch. The hoofprint was so close that she couldn't comfort herself that it was just a memory or a shadow. Someone had followed Kase, and if he saw the trail of blood leading to the cabin, Eve Calder would no longer be a widow living alone. She would become a harborer of the enemy. Kase sat leaning against the table leg, his breath ragged. Eve tore off an old sleeve from Ben's shirt to make a bandage, pressing hard on the wound on his shoulder. He didn't cry out. She clenched her jaw, her eyes fixed on the crack in the door as if she could hear footsteps before the ground even realized it. "How many men does Crowe have?" Eve asked. "Enough to make the town believe anything he writes in his report." The answer was colder than the wind outside. Eve washed the blood from her hands in the tin basin, but the water immediately turned a deep crimson. She looked at the blood, then at Ben's rifle hanging on the wall. For 2 years, she had tried to believe her husband died in a senseless attack. A dangerous land, a wrong night, a death without reason. But if Kase is telling the truth, Ben died seeing a gun smuggling ring. And the man known throughout the region as Major Harlan Crowe wasn't a man of order. He was a seller of chaos, profiting from fear. A hoofbeat sounded in the yard, slow, deliberate. Eve blew out the small lamp, leaving only a low flame in the fireplace. Kase tried to stand, but she placed her hand on his chest, holding him back. Not gently, not intimately, just the command of someone who knew this house better than anyone. "You've bled enough on my floor," she said. "Now let me lie." Outside, a man's voice spoke, falsely polite. "Mrs. Calder? Major Crowe wants to know if you saw a wounded Apache pass by." Eve picked up Ben's rifle. For the first time in 2 years, she opened the door not to survive, but to conceal the truth. Eve opened the door just enough for her body to hide the bloodstain on the floor. The man on the porch wore a snow-covered hat, a civilian coat, but clean, mud-free military-styled boots. His eyes didn't meet hers first. He looked over her shoulder into the house. "I didn't see any Apache," Eve said. Her voice was dry and even. "All I see is wind, snow, and Crowe's men who like to question widows after dark." He chuckled softly, but his hand remained near the gun. "Major is only worried about you. This area isn't safe, especially for a woman who keeps a cabin right next to the Cold Mesa Trail." Eve understood that wasn't a warning. It was a confiscated piece of paper, unwritten. "That trail doesn't belong to Crowe," she replied. His smile faded. "Your husband said the same thing." The atmosphere between them stiffened. Behind Eve, from the dark corner of the cabin, Kase didn't utter a sound. But she knew he'd heard. He knew the name Ben had just been dragged out like a noose. The man looked down at the stone steps. Snow had covered almost all the bloodstain, but not fast enough. Eve took a step down, deliberately placing her heel on the remaining red mark. "If Major Crowe wants to talk about the land," she said, "tell him to come during the day, and tell him to bring the real papers." He looked at her longer than a messenger should. Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving a sentence carried on the wind. "There are widows who survive by knowing how to keep silent, Mrs. Calder." Eve closed the door. This time her hand trembled as she bolted it. Kase remained in the darkness, his face pale from blood loss. He saw it. "Saw what?" "It's not blood. I see you're not afraid in the right way anymore." Eve didn't answer. She walked to Ben's trunk, opening the cloth lining at the bottom. Inside were an old notebook, a piece of Cold Mesa Trail map, and a scrap of oilcloth with military supply markings. Kase looked at them, his eyes darkening. "Ben kept the evidence," he said, "and Crowe knows you still have it." Eve placed Ben's notebook on the table, but didn't open it immediately. Old dust clung to the leather cover like cold ashes. For the past 2 years, she had kept it because it was the last thing Ben's hands had ever touched. Tonight, for the first time, she understood she wasn't keeping a memento. She was keeping a sentence. Kase leaned closer to the firelight. His shoulder wound was bandaged, but blood still seeped through the cloth. He pointed to a short entry in his notebook. Flour, 6 barrels, delivered via Cold Mesa Trail. Next to it was the weight, circled in black ink by Ben. "No flour weighs that much," Kase said. "That's a gun." Eve turned to the next page. There was the name, Harlan Crowe. The delivery date, the supply designation, written askew as if deliberately concealed. Ben had seen it. Ben had understood. And that's why Ben didn't return. Outside, the wind whistled through the ravine like someone sharpening a knife on a rock. Kase gazed toward the red cliff to the east. Cold Mesa Trail isn't just a wagon road. It cuts through the winter hunting grounds, through the place where the elders left stone markers for their descendants to find their way back. If Crowe brings his supplies through there, he's not just taking land. He's turning my people's laws into a wheel track. Eve didn't ask what those laws meant. Kase's silence after the statement was enough for her to understand. There are things that can't be explained verbally to outsiders. She took the notebook, wrapped it in Ben's scarf, and hid it behind a crack in the rock by the fireplace. Kase watched, not stopping her. "If Crowe comes," he said, "he'll burn the cabin down to find it." Eve turned to the stable outside the window, where Ben's last horse stood in the shadows. "Then before he comes," she replied, "we must make this house bite." But just as she finished speaking, a figure stood on the edge of the ravine. A young Apache woman, no name called, no approach, just looking at the misaligned stone mark in front of the cabin door. Then she placed a dry blade of grass on the snow. Kase closed his eyes. "My people know." Kase stood looking at the dry blade of grass on the snow for a long time. Eve didn't ask who the Apache woman was. She only saw how his hand closed, slowly and heavily, as if a door had just closed behind them both. "She didn't come to warn," Kase said. "She came to witness." Eve looked outside. On the edge of the ravine, the young woman had disappeared. Only the blade of grass lay beside the crooked rock, so fragile that a gust of wind could blow it away. But Kase looked at it as if it were a judgment. For the rest of the night, they prepared in silence. Eve tied the tin can to a thin string between 2 dry cactus bushes. Kase covered the bloodstain on the porch with ash. She hid Ben's notebook behind a rock crevice by the fireplace, then placed a loose page in her coat pocket. If Crowe burned the cabin, at least part of the truth would still be on her. Near noon, the pale sun hung over Cold Mesa like an old coin. Then the sound of wagon wheels came from the east. Not fast, not stealthy. Crowe didn't come like a thief. He came like someone who believed this land belonged to him. 3 wagons covered with tarpaulins passed through the rocky crevice. Behind them were mercenaries, 2 pale-faced small landowners, and Major Harlan Crowe on a black horse. His coat was clean. His gloves were clean. Only his eyes were dirty. Eve stepped out the door, Ben's rifle lying horizontally in her hand. Kase stood hidden behind the stone wall, his wound still bleeding under the bandage. Crowe smiled. "Mrs. Calder, I've come to protect this route." At that very moment, the first wagon wheel crushed over the stone marking the red leather strap. The strap snapped. The stone rolled aside, leaving a dark streak in the snow. Kase gently closed her eyes, not out of fear, because it was too late to keep everything intact. Eve took another step, holding up the burnt-edge page of the notebook in front of Crowe. "No," she said. "You've come to bury what my husband wrote." And from behind her, Kase stepped into the light. When Kase stepped into the light, no one fired immediately. It was that silence that chilled Eve. A dozen gun barrels were pointed toward the cabin door. and Crowe sat still on his horse, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "A white widow concealing an armed Apache," Crowe said, his voice loud enough for the two landowners behind him to hear. "Mrs. Calder, your husband would be ashamed if he were still alive." Eve held the page in her hand. The edge of the paper trembled slightly in the wind. "Not because of her. My husband died because he saw you selling guns to bandits." Crowe didn't look at the page. He looked at the people with him. A man like him didn't need the truth to disappear. He only needed it to look like the words of a desperate woman. "Ben Calder was killed in an Apache attack," he replied. "And today, his widow stands beside our enemy." At the edge of the ravine, Eve caught a glimpse of the young Apache woman from earlier. She stood between two rocks, neither approaching nor calling out to anyone, just watching. Kase saw her too. His eyes darkened, not with shame, but with the understanding that from this moment on, every action of his would be recorded for his men to remember. Crowe gestured. Two mercenaries dismounted and drove a military stake into the ground in front of the cabin. Each hammer blow felt like a blow to Eve's chest. "Cold Mesa cabin will be temporarily detained for investigation," Crowe declared. "Cold Mesa Trail is under military protection." Eve looked at the stake in front of her house. No papers were presented, no court. Only guns, horses, and a man who knew how to call robbery the law. Kase took half a step forward. Eve subtly raised her rifle, not to point it at Crowe, but to stop him from going any further. If he lunged, Crowe would have the excuse he needed. But that excuse still came. From behind the wagon, a sudden shot rang out. An Apache soldier, observing from the rocky slope, fell to the snow. Crowe drew his gun, shouting before the smoke cleared. "Apache fired first!" Before Crowe's shout had faded in the wind, Cold Mesa erupted into a cloud of gunpowder smoke. His men yanked the reins, turning their rifles toward the rocky slope where the Apache had fallen. No one asked who had fired first. Crowe had given them the answer. And in this land, a word spoken loudly enough could sometimes be more dangerous than a bullet. Eve saw Kase tighten his grip on the knife at his side. One more step, and he would lunge at Crowe. But she grasped his arm, not gently, not pleading, just holding him back for a moment. "If you kill him now," she whispered, "he will win even in death." Kase looked at her. There was fire in his eyes, but behind that fire was something deeper. Desecrated land, blood used as a lie, and a man standing still when every part of him wanted to lunge. Crowe ordered the wagon to move forward. The wheels crunched through the snow, dragging the tarpaulin-covered cargo. A corner of the tarpaulin ripped open, revealing the barrel of a gun wrapped in oilcloth. Eve needed no further proof that Ben had written correctly. "The left rope," Kase said quickly. "Cut it! The wagon will tilt." Eve understood. She didn't shoot Crowe. She shot at the wooden peg holding the tow rope. The bullet startled the horse in front. The wagon veered off course. Kase lunged out, crouching low under the gunfire, cutting the remaining saddle rope with his knife. The heavy wagon slid to the edge of the rock, the cargo crashing into the snow, the contraband gun flying out like white bones in the midday sun. The mercenaries froze. The two landowners saw it. The Apache woman on the rocky slope saw it too. Crowe stopped smiling. He drew his gun and fired at Eve's stable. The fire caught the dry straw, flaring up behind the cabin. Ben's last horse neighed, its hooves pounding the wooden planks. Eve turned. Ben's notebook was still hidden in the house. The stable was burning. Kase was standing in the line of fire, and for the first time, Eve understood that justice didn't ask her what she wanted to lose. It only asked her which she would lose first. Eve didn't run toward the stable immediately. It hurt her more than the smoke. Ben's horse was neighing in the fire, but Ben's notebook lay behind the crack in the stone by the fireplace. One was the last vestige of her old life. The other was the reason that life had been stolen. Kase saw her hesitation. He understood before she spoke. He turned amidst the gunfire, throwing his knife to cut the stable bolt from a distance. The door burst open. The horse galloped out in smoke, its charred reins dragging on the snow. But that very moment exposed Kase. A bullet ripped through his side, sending him crashing to the side of the overturned wagon. Eve didn't call his name. Calling him now would only weaken her grip. She rushed into the cabin. Smoke crept under the low roof, stinging her eyes. She covered her mouth with a handkerchief, knelt by the fireplace, and dug her fingernails into the cracks in the stone until blood came out. The notebook fell, burning hot, its edges catching fire. Eve extinguished it with the palm of her hand. Her skin burned, but she didn't let go. Outside, Crowe shouted the order to capture Kase alive. He knew that if Kase died as an ambush target, his story would still stand. But if Kase lived long enough to point to the gun barrel, if Eve lived long enough to read the name in the notebook, then Major Harlan Crowe would no longer be a lineman. He would be a war merchant. Eve tore off the page with Crowe's signature and tucked it into her scarf. She left the rest of the notebook on the table, where the fire licked at Ben's handwriting. She paused briefly before the wedding box. Ben's ring was inside. Their small photograph was there too. The wooden roof creaked overhead. Eve turned away. When she emerged from the smoke, her hands covered in ash, Kase was kneeling before Crowe's gun. Eve held up the half-burned piece of paper without speaking to Crowe. She looked toward the Apache woman on the rocky slope. Remember this signature. Crowe looked at the charred piece of paper in Eve's hand, then up at the rocky slope where the young Apache woman still stood motionless. For the first time since arriving in Cold Mesa, he understood there was something a gun couldn't penetrate. The memory of a witness. "No one will believe you," Crowe growled. Eve stepped down from the burning threshold. Ash fell from her hair. Her hand burned, but the paper remained clutched between her fingers. "Not everyone needs to believe," she said. "Just enough people who can't pretend they didn't see." Two small landowners watched the crates of guns fall from the wagon. One mercenary stepped back, lowering his rifle by half an inch. It wasn't courage, just the instinct of those who knew the ship was sinking and didn't want to sink with the captain. Crowe turned his gun toward Eve. But Kase rose before he could pull the trigger. Blood stained his shirt black. His steps were unsteady, but the knife in his hand still followed its course. He knocked the gun out of Crowe's hand, throwing him down beside the military stake he had just driven into the cabin door. For a moment, Eve thought Kase would kill him. All of Cold Mesa seemed to be waiting for that. But Kase didn't stab. He picked up the red leather cord that had been cut by the wagon wheel and tied Crowe's wrist to his own stake. Not as a victory, as a reminder that some things, once broken, can never be put back together. The fire behind Eve died down. Cold Mesa cabin, Ben's last home, was now just a black frame and thin smoke. Eve didn't go back for the wedding box. Nothing in it could return Ben to her. The young Apache woman stepped down, picking up the askew stone. She didn't straighten it. She just placed it at an angle beside a piece of coal from the cabin. Then she looked at Kase, at Eve, and silently left. Kase bent down to pick up Ben's rifle, handing it back to Eve. She took it, then tore off a charred scarf and tied it around the wound on his hand. No one said thank you. No one made a promise. As snow began to fall again on the Cold Mesa Trail, Eve and Kase rode their horses toward the Red Gorge. Behind them, the askew stone still lay tilted in the cold ash. but it was still there. If Eve and Kase's story kept you there until the very end, thank you for joining us on the Cold Mesa Trail. There are wounds that never disappear, but they remind us of what we still have to hold on to. Subscribe to the channel to continue following stories of the Wild West, filled with love, honor, and choices that cannot be reversed.